Hi, welcome to the discussion on the sideline of the World Marketing Summit Malaysia 2013. And I have a very special guest with me. He was at the first round table, very impressive in his presentation. It's about the MDG 1, Millennium Development Goal 1, to eradicate extreme poverty and hunger. I would like to introduce now my guest, Mr. Shahid Malik. Thank you so much for making time. Very impressive CV as a career politician, especially since 2005 to 2010. You hold at least 3 key portfolios using the Asian view, international minister, communities and local government minister, justice and home office minister. So now you go around the world also advising governments and looking at IT, renewable energy, health and stuff. But I want to come back to extreme poverty and hunger. Sure. One key salient point that I can take from your session, to link governance and politics back to poverty and extreme hunger.
Sure.
And you make the case in point that if we only look at terrorism, of course there is a serious threat, but maybe we should also look at the causes of terrorism. And that discussion has always been in Malaysia, putting out to the world that we should not only look at terrorism act itself, but the reason behind it. And poverty, lack of education doesn't help. So I would like to give you the chance again to tell our audience that didn't have the opportunity to be in the hall of this point of yours.
Yeah. Thought is, it just shows just how much wisdom there is in Malaysia. Sadly, that wisdom isn't shared by everybody. But my fundamental perspective on this is that the so-called war on terror is doomed to failure unless there's a parallel on the causes of terror, and that is poverty, it's a lack of education, it's injustices, and of course it is a perversion of religion, because some people who, I mean, my own constituency of Dewsbury at the time, the lead bomber on the 7th of July, Mohammed Sadiq Khan, was one of my constituents. We all know about 7/7, over 50 people died in London. And I came out and said very powerfully, he and others believe that they are martyrs going to heaven.
Yeah.
But my Islam tells me they're not martyrs going to heaven, they're sinners going to hell. And it's the responsibility of all Muslims to educate people as well as themselves on that fundamental issue. So I think poverty you can't look at in isolation. And I think governance is also a big challenge, because have governments got their priorities right? Sometimes a disproportionate amount of the budget goes on military hardware, when the real enemy between these countries is a common one. It's not each other. The real enemy is disease, lack of education, etc. So if you reduce the military spending, you increase that spending.
It'll be an interesting position for you, because you have Asian roots. But you grow up and you went into the Labour Party in the UK and all that, and you even in the cabinet. Very different portfolio that you had. The International Development Minister, for example, you had the opportunity to determine where the United Kingdom's aid will go to in that respect. And many people from the less developed nations in Africa or even Asia, where the bottom maybe 50 to 60% of the world populations are, and they look at the developed nation like in the West and say it's easier for them to be in that high chair and say what's wrong with us. Maybe what's been wrong with us is also linked to what they have done in the whole wide world. When we talk about equality, when we talk about justice, you also mentioned the phrase, it's not about democracy, maybe also it's about hypocrisy. So how do you coin that? Because you have Asian root, you have to determine where the policy of the UK as far as national aid goes. And
well, listen, you're absolutely right. You know, you can't have a stance where you say you believe in democracy and freedom, and then when people have democratic elections, you say we don't like the outcome there, because that isn't democracy, that becomes hypocrisy. And we undermine our own, the principles and the values that we espouse, we undermine them by doing that, and we should be ashamed of that. But a lot of the problems were historic. I've got to say, and a lot of the problems that people face in different parts of the world are down to people like the UK and others, because they were colonies of ours. We created certain problems there. I won't say there was, I mean, we did do some good work. I think that's acknowledged by people, but we created a lot of problems. But in today's world, I think the reality is that we could do much more to help deal with conflict by helping prevent it in the first place.
All right.
Because every pound spent on conflict prevention saves £4 on the actual conflict itself. So it's in our interests, it's a no-brainer. But sadly, our commitment is limited, and we're too eager to spend many, many billions on engaging in wars and not enough on saving lives.
You look at disproportionate distribution of a country's GDP power in terms of how much they spend on defense and how much they spend for poverty alleviation, for example. You gave the case in point of how the rivalry between Pakistan and India resulted in a lot of people that could have gotten maybe more education, more food on the table, but no, the money has to go, a lot of it, to defense.
Yeah.
But if we look at it, if I take a bigger macro picture, the industrial military complex doesn't start in countries like Pakistan or India, right? So if we look at the global scale, look at how much US is spending on defense as compared to what they do in aid, for example. So as UK is the closest partner to America in a lot of things, how do you see this, being in the cabinet and now being outside?
I've got to say one really important thing. I mean, I'm proud of the UK for this reason. Since this economic crisis, our aid each year has been increasing, moving up to this magic 0.7% of our national income spent on aid. The other thing I'm proud of is, unlike many countries, and I include the US in this, we are led by poverty. So we don't look, is this country a friend of ours? Does this country have the same political ideology? We actually look at, is there poverty there, and can we invest to help deal with that poverty? The other thing that we do is, the overwhelming amount of our aid is spent in country by people in that country. So in Afghanistan, something like 92 cents of every dollar will be spent in Afghanistan. That isn't true of other countries. So I think we can be proud of the things that we've done. And I think, unfortunately, it is the case that when it's come to some major decisions on Iraq, on Afghanistan, we haven't been able to stand our corner. I think in Afghanistan, to be frank, I think people felt there was a case. In Iraq, patently there was no case. There was an American urgency for war. We should have done more to firstly say, let's look at the evidence, secondly get an explicit second UN resolution, and then try to move forward if we needed to. But sadly we didn't do that. So I think we've learned and we're learning, and that's why the now leader of the Labour Party, Ed Miliband, has said that Iraq was wrong, and if it happened tomorrow, we wouldn't go down that route. I personally at the time was on TV against the Iraq war because I didn't see the weapons inspectors giving me evidence. I didn't share the American optimism and urgency for war.
So we've made the point that you can't just see poverty in isolation from the policies of a country or international policies. I have to go for the first commercial break, but once we are back, you mentioned the magic name of Ed Miliband. I wish he's been to Malaysia where I can interview him, but not that you're the spokesperson for the Labour Party, but moving forward, where do you think the leadership for the world will be? Because we keep going back to the UK, we keep going back to America, we keep going back to Russia, even for Syria. And you even mentioned Syria here. So after this break, I'm going to ask you to maybe...
I'll give you some good answers on that.
Give us a few pointers on that right after this. Thank you for still watching a special recording on the sideline of the World Marketing Summit Malaysia 2013. I'm still here with Shahid Malik. He's a very interesting character at this World Marketing Summit, but safe to say, I'm going to ask you about the Labour Party now and what's in store for the future. We know that, of course, the democracy in UK is more adventurous as compared to maybe Malaysia. You know, we still have the same party and our opposition is still trying to gather themselves. But the two-party system has matured in that sense for UK. But there's a lot of issues. Syria, for example, and Iraq has no closure in that respect. At the same time, domestically, I mean, we look at the far-right movement. We look at BNP, for example, and I'm like, how do you come to terms with all that? You do have a large Asian community, for example, and a Muslim community
Sure,
at that.
sure.
We have heard the Archbishop of Canterbury, you know, maybe, let me put it as putting forth the thought and idea that maybe we should have some semblance of the Sharia consideration into the governance of the Muslim in Britain.
Sure.
But these are wide-ranging disparities.
Yeah. Well, you've touched on international, domestic, and very local. But let me just say on the international front, and going back to the Malaysian wisdom, which is going to root causes, these problems in the world, the root cause actually goes back to the United Nations and the way that it's structured. It can't be right that 5 permanent members decide what happens and what doesn't happen.
Yep.
That can't be the world that we live in. We need a more democratic and meritocratic United Nations. We need massive reform. If we're going to have permanent members, you know, maybe we need about 15 permanent members. You know, countries like Malaysia are possible, your neighbour Indonesia.
If Labour forms the next government, would that be a main criteria for foreign policy?
If Labour forms the next government, there is no doubt that we are clear that we need massive reform of the United Nations. We need to bring in a lot of new players. I mean, you can't ignore the likes of India. That are in South America, you know, you've got places like Brazil. You can't ignore these countries. And so we've got to get both the small and the big feeling as they're part of this United Nations. Otherwise, it's a rich fat boys club which excludes people. And each one of those players at the moment have the power of veto. So we need massive reform in the UN. If we get that, these conflicts and everything else will be dealt with in a much more equitable way, in a way that people can understand.
Cool.
Domestically. We have got challenges. I've got to say to you, the majority of the BNP vote actually isn't, I don't believe, some of it is, I'd be naive to say otherwise, but a lot of it, perhaps the majority, is not because people don't like foreigners. It's because people are just frustrated, and it's a protest. They're frustrated, you know, with respect to your democracy, you know, you've had decades, we've had, you know, nearly 1,000 years off and on. Ours is a much longer democracy. People just getting fed up with things. And sometimes they can't even understand what they're getting fed up about. They can't define it.
Really?
But they feel angry about something. Maybe because somebody else has done better than them. Maybe because they hear in the media that foreigners are getting this and immigrants are getting that. It's not true. So I think if you go back to root causes, it's two front. One undoubtedly is the media. The media has profound responsibility and it has profound power. It exercises the latter, not enough of the exercises the former, which is responsibility, seldom, exercises the latter, which is power, all too often. And the media formulates the views of a lot of the people in any country. So you can't blame people if they think in a certain way, if they don't know any better because they're reading from the media. So I think our print media in particular is not as healthy as it could be. The TV media actually is very, very healthy. We've got legislation that means that they can't do certain things, whereas the print one, unfortunately, it's very populist, and sometimes they tell lots of lies, frankly speaking, and especially on immigration and race issues. So that then helps people feel as if something is going on, that a refugee has got, you know, a new TV and they haven't, when it isn't true. So we need to do a lot of education. The media needs to be more responsible, and I think then you'll start to deal with the issues of the BNP. But also politicians need to connect with these people who feel frustrated, to give them a sense of hope.
What about people who think that because it's just mainly a two-party system, it's not representing enough of the pluralism that maybe now more than ever, more than maybe 4-6 decades ago in the UK itself?
Yeah. I think that, I mean, I don't think that's as big an issue as in this country. And if I can be frank, I mean, I think it's a terrible system where people form parties on ethnic lines. I don't think you can get cohesion that way. The beauty about and the strength of Malaysia, it's diversity. But you mustn't let a diverse society become a divided one. And somehow you've got to have parties that embrace everybody. This is like Northern Ireland. You know, in Northern Ireland, in this sense, in Northern Ireland, the unionist parties will have all the Protestants. You know, the Republican parties will have all the Catholics. You know, the SDLP will have the Catholics. You know, that cannot be the healthy future for anybody. What we need to see in Malaysia, this is not me lecturing, I would say this anywhere to any people. I say it in my own country in different ways. What we need in Malaysia, I think, is parties that people feel speaks for them no matter who they are. At the moment, people feel as if they've got to be in a certain ethnic group, whether it's Indian, Chinese, Malay, and I don't see that as long-term healthy, and I think that's a challenge for Malaysia. And I think the idea of this one nation, it's a good idea, but actually it mustn't become like the England football team, which is good on paper but not very good on grass. So the implementation is a real challenge.
Agreed.
But in the UK we've got similar challenges, but we have parties that speak for everybody. So the Conservative speaks for everybody. Usually if you're rich, but if you're Muslim, Christian, Jew and rich, you can go to the Conservatives. If you believe in equity, if you believe in fairness, if you're working class or not, then the Labour Party is the party for you. So it cuts across religious and ethnic groups in a way that in Malaysia I don't think, and pardon my ignorance if I'm wrong, I don't think you've quite got right yet.
Maybe we're not doing it in singular parties, but they have coalitions, and how far the coalition can implement what you said. But I would like to go back to what you said about the media and the rest. However, if we look at EU as a whole, a supranational entity, and there's a lot of angst against centralization of power to Brussels, not just in the UK,
Sure.
but you can see that also in the movement in Germany, one of the biggest and most powerful member.
Sure.
Of course, in Holland, you have Geert Wilders and whatever else.
Yeah.
And in the EU election, you see more from this side of the political spectrum getting seats in Brussels. So how does it work on that particular front?
It's quite ironic, really, that these people are against Europe, but they stand as MEPs,
Yes.
and they succeed. Listen, I think the problem with Europe is a very simple one. Europe has let itself down in terms of being able to communicate what it's about to
Okay.
ordinary people.
Okay.
That's the challenge. Europe seems like a very complex idea. How do you make it simple and digestible for ordinary people? I think we've failed to do that. And again, to be honest, the media hasn't played a positive role. They've used the exception, i.e. silly things that go on Europe, and presented them as the rule, as the norm. And that needs to be challenged as well. But there's no doubt that people everywhere, that they want to have more control of their lives. And the way that you do that is to devolve power. So we've done it in the UK. We've now got a Scottish Parliament that our government set up. We've got a Welsh Assembly, a Northern Ireland Assembly. So people can have some control over their own lives. But this is not an either or. You can have that and have a strong Europe, because some things you need to be doing at a European level, because then you get consistency of quality, you get an understanding across Europe. And to be honest, in the New World Order, you need a unified Europe as a counterweight to Russia, the US, and to China.
You're still watching a special recording on the sideline of World Marketing Summit Malaysia, and I've always been thinking since small, if all of us across the world support different football clubs in the Barclays Premier League, then why can't we unite on so many other issues? So that's just one of the ironies of the world that we have. But at the same time now, in the 21st century, we're not just looking at nations. There are entities that goes beyond nations.
Sure.
Maybe that's good, because the challenges facing humanity right now, climate change, whatever else, is beyond the borders of the country. So how do you look at the hope for the more roles of private sector coming into play? Because some look at it as very, very fearful, because these are corporations run on profit and bottom lines.
And just to say that the quickest way to lift people out of poverty is to grow the economy, to get businesses to be doing what they do best. But we can't live in a world of the past where the only thing that counted was the bottom line. People have got to recognise they've got a responsibility beyond the margins that they seek to attain. And in that sense, governments have got a responsibility when they engage with business to set out what is expected of them. And if we go very quickly, very briefly back to one of the earlier points on the militarisation in some countries, well, the beneficiaries of this are the arms producers in the West quite often, and so there's a conflict there.
Agreed.
So I think that it's right that multinationals create growth, create employment, create prosperity, but they do so in a more equal way and with a conscience. We want business and profits, but with a conscience. In the past, it's been at any cost. That can't be the future. And so there's legislation global that can deal with it, but also each individual country has got its legislation to make sure that people don't just reap from the country, that they actually invest in that country as well. So they've got rights to gain profits, they've got responsibilities to have a social conscience.
You can legislate, but it's like bringing a horse to water. You can't make the horse drink water.
No, and that's where people come in, and that's where people are so important. Certainly in the West, more so than ever before, the best way to motivate any multinational is to target some of their weaknesses. So if, for example, a multinational is running what you might call a sweatshop, if we can promote that, that's where the media can play a positive role. If the media promotes that, then believe me, in the West, their profits will go down, their sales will go down. So it's that threat that keeps them on their toes. What we've got to say to the business community is, actually, by doing the right thing, it's good for your balance sheet. Why? Because more customers in the West are more alive to being better human beings, better citizens of the world, and they don't want to exploit people. So they're willing to pay 50 pence more for a vest or £10 more for a suit if they know that the people who make it are working under good terms and conditions. And I think that, in part, we've got to play a lot more with the kind of fair trade movement, if you will.
What hope would the communities or individuals in society have to gain the right of information to that, when we know that this corporation, again the word marketing here, this is the World Marketing Summit, is all very powerful and has been proven powerful in reaping profits by making and inducing or convincing people that this is the best brand, this is the best service or product. Now, if that power is being turned onto the social side of things, what hope would one politician have, for example, against this big and mighty giant?
Well, let me give you two issues. One is the lobbying movement, which I think needs to be regulated much better, and especially in the US, but also in the UK and Europe. Put them to one side. I want to give you an example of how things can work. We know that powdered milk is not as good for a newborn child as natural milk. And what the World Health Organization has said very clearly, that in the first 6 months, the mother's milk is the best. There were some milk powder companies that were advertising, trying to get impressionable mothers, perhaps those that aren't terribly well educated, to believe that their milk is better almost than natural milk. Now, once that got out, there was a big uproar, and these people were petrified. Now they advertise by saying, we all know in the first 6 months mother's milk is much better than anything else. However, after that, if you want to change, then perhaps you would consider. So the marketing side of it can actually go against them, because if there are things that they're saying that are fundamentally flawed and it's communicated elsewhere, then there's a real black mark against their name, which will cause some difficulties in terms of profitability. So they're now aligned with their board members in being more conscious about what they do.
One last point, because we started by linking politics and governance to poverty. For 60 over years, we've seen the Israeli-Palestine conflict not being solved. And this is a root cause for a lot of bad things in the global world today. So how do we, once and for all, we must do it and do it now, solve this?
Well, let me tell you frankly that unfortunately, this is one of the things that gives power and is a recruiting sergeant for the extremists. Because there are UN resolutions that are, 46, 50 years old, 60 years old, that aren't implemented. In Afghanistan, the UN resolution was implemented in 5 minutes. In Iraq, we didn't need one. In Libya, it was implemented in 3 minutes. And yet, on Palestine, we've got, since 1967, Resolution 224, 338. Even on Kashmir, we have resolutions between India and Pakistan, dating back to 1947. They're not been implemented. So we need this reform in the UN, so we can have a UN which is not about differential justice, i.e. one rule for you and one rule for me, but it's about equal justice, the same rule for you, the same rule for me.
So my audience who believe in this would have to help support Labour to be the next government for this. What are the chances of that happening?
The chances are very good, because the current government has not been able to manage the economy in these very difficult circumstances, and actually they've been quite cruel to a lot of people, and they're feeling that now.
Like
So I
student
think-
fees.
Well, yeah. I mean, one part of the government said they weren't going to they were going to get rid of student fees,
Okay.
and they trebled them. But also, disabled people now are having problems in housing with their benefits. Educational maintenance allowances for poor students have disappeared.
So would we see Mr. Shahid Malik, the MP, back
Uh,
if that happens?
I think there's certainly a likelihood of that happening.
Okay.
It might not. We'll see in time.
Thank you so much,
Pleasure
Mr.
was all
Shahid
mine.
Malik. The
Thank you.
disclaimer here about the UK politics is that Mr. Shahid Malik is from the Labour Party.
Guilty as charged.
But I'm sure you give your best opinions on most things. And we'll hope to see you again in Malaysia very, very soon. Thank you.
Pleasure. Thank
You've
you.
been watching a special edition of a recording on the sideline of World Marketing Summit Malaysia 2013. Good night and goodbye.